The lecture hall hummed with quiet murmurs, the air thick with an unspoken energy. The grand auditorium, a space meant for learning and intellectual debate, felt strangely cold that afternoon. Rows of wooden desks stretched out in perfect symmetry, occupied by students of various backgrounds, some leaning forward attentively, others mindlessly scrolling through their laptops. At the front, beneath the imposing glow of a projector, stood Professor William Hawthorne, a man known for his razor-sharp wit and an unsettling arrogance that often teetered on the edge of controversy. Seated near the middle row was Malcolm Carter, a young black student with sharp eyes and a quiet confidence that belied the storm of emotions always brewing beneath his calm exterior. He had worked too hard to be here, scholarships, late nights, and a relentless drive to prove himself in an institution where he often felt like an outsider. The Ivy League lecture hall, with its century-old traditions and unspoken hierarchies, was not built for students like him. Yet, here he was, navigating a world that seemed determined to remind him of his difference at every turn. The class was a philosophy seminar, the ethics of society, a space meant to challenge perspectives and push boundaries. But today, something was different. Today, there was an edge in the air, a shift in tone that Malcolm could feel before the words were even spoken. Professor Hawthorne leaned against the podium, a smug smirk playing on his lips as he adjusted his glasses. His voice, deep and calculated, filled the room. Society, as we all know, is built upon intelligence, discipline, and a clear hierarchy, he began, pacing slowly. Some civilizations thrive, while others struggle. History has shown us that certain groups, whether due to culture, choices, or simply an inherent nature, tend to lag behind. Malcolm's spine stiffened. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others chuckled under their breath. The professor's words were carefully veiled, but Malcolm knew exactly where this was going. Take, for example, the economic and academic disparities we see in certain demographics. Hawthorne continued, his gaze sweeping the room. Is it merely systemic oppression? Or could it be that some cultures prioritize progress while others, well, simply do not? A pause. A sharp inhale from a student in the front row. A nervous tap, tap, tap of a pencil against the desk. Malcolm clenched his jaw. He had heard comments like this before, dressed up as intellectual discourse, masked as objective analysis. It was always the same. A professor throwing out a casual slight, expecting no challenge, expecting black students like him to lower their gaze and let the moment pass. But today, something inside Malcolm refused to stay silent. His pulse drummed. In his ears, his fingers gripping the edges of his notebook, he felt the stares, some expectant, some indifferent, some amused. He could see the subtle smirk on Hawthorne's face, the way he folded his arms, as if daring anyone to object. The professor wanted a reaction. He wanted to see if Malcolm would crumble under the weight of his words, if he would let the moment slip by like so many before. Malcolm exhaled slowly. If he spoke now, there would be consequences. He knew how this worked. Students who challenged authority too boldly risked being labeled as aggressive, emotional, or ungrateful. But if he stayed silent, he would have to live with the weight of regret. The room held its breath. Malcolm's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. The sound echoed, cutting through the charged silence like a blade. Every eye in the room snapped to him. A few students shifted, eager to see where this was going. Others lowered their gazes, unwilling to be part of the confrontation. Professor Hawthorne raised an eyebrow, his smirk deepening. "Ah, Mr. Carter, something to add?" Malcolm swallowed the lump in his throat. He locked eyes with the professor, his voice steady, measured, but carrying an undeniable fire beneath it. "I have a question, Professor," he said, his words slicing through the room with quiet intensity. The room seemed to shrink around them, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. If intelligence and discipline determine success, then tell me, how did my ancestors build civilizations long before the West even knew what structured society was? Silence. A ripple of electricity passed through the class. Hawthorne's smirk faltered for the briefest moment before returning, but Malcolm caught it. He had struck a nerve. The air felt heavy, the weight of centuries pressing into this one moment, and then the door creaked open. A faculty member stepped in, their expression unreadable. Something was about to shift, and Malcolm was ready. The words from the previous day still lingered in Malcolm's mind as he walked through campus, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He had always known that being here meant walking a tightrope. Speak too little, and he would be invisible. Speak too much, and he would be labeled difficult, disruptive. His mother had warned him before he left for college. She had sat him down in their small living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows on her tired face. Malcolm, there will be moments when they try to make you small, when they try to twist history, twist truth, and make you feel like you do not belong, but you remember where you come from, you remember who you are. He had promised her he would, but what she had not told him was how exhausting it would be. As he entered the lecture hall, he felt the shift immediately. Eyes on him, some curious, some skeptical. The students who usually nodded in passing hesitated now, as if unsure whether to acknowledge him. Others, emboldened by the professor's thinly veiled dismissal of him yesterday, smirked as he walked by. He took his seat, rolling his shoulders to shake off the weight pressing down on him. Aaron sat a few rows ahead, turning slightly to meet his gaze. It was not exactly a warning this time, more like a question. "You good?" Malcolm gave a small nod, but his grip on his notebook tightened. Professor Hawthorne entered the room with his usual air of authority, his presence commanding attention. He placed his notes on the podium and glanced up, that ever-present smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Before we begin," he said smoothly, "I want to address something from our last discussion. It seems that some students feel quite passionately about historical narratives, and while passion is admirable, we must always ensure our arguments are rooted in objective reality, not emotion." A ripple went through the room, some students shifting in their seats. Malcolm could feel the shift before the words even landed on him. "For instance," Hawthorne continued, "we often hear claims about Africa's great civilizations, but if these societies were so advanced, why did they fall so easily to European powers?" The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. A few students glanced at Malcolm, waiting. Others averted their eyes, unwilling to be part of whatever was about to unfold. Ishran sat rigidly in his chair, his fingers tapping against the desk in a steady rhythm, his way of saying, "Do not take the bait." Malcolm took a slow breath. He had seen this tactic before. Hawthorne was not looking for a discussion. He was looking for compliance, but Malcolm had already made up his mind. Deliberately, he set down his pen and leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. "Professor," he said, his voice measured but unwavering, "do you truly want an answer, or do you just want to see if I will break?" The room froze. For the first time, Hawthorne hesitated. It was barely perceptible, a brief flicker of something unreadable in his expression, and in that moment Malcolm knew. The power in the room had shifted, and so had everything else. The moment Malcolm's words left his mouth, the atmosphere in the lecture hall became electric. It was as if the entire class had collectively held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Some students leaned forward, eyes darting between him and Professor Hawthorne. Others smirked, sensing that Malcolm had just crossed an invisible line. Hawthorne's smirk did not vanish, but it changed, tightening into something colder, something more calculated. Interesting, the professor mused, tapping his fingers against the podium. So, rather than engaging with the question, you attempt to question me. A clever diversion, Mr. Carter, but hardly an answer. Malcolm refused to flinch. He could feel Aaron's silent warning from across the room, urging him to let it go. But something inside him refused to shrink back into silence. "It is not a diversion," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "It is an observation. You are not asking this question to have a discussion. You are asking it to belittle an entire history of people while pretending it is intellectual inquiry." A few gasps scattered through the room. Someone chuckled under their breath. The tension thickened like a gathering storm. Hawthorne's jaw twitched. "Be careful, Mr. Carter," he said smoothly, adjusting his tie. "You are a student in my class, and students who do not respect academic discourse often find themselves struggling to succeed." There it was, the threat. Dressed up as professional decorum, but Malcolm heard it loud and clear. "I respect academic discourse," Malcolm said, his voice unwavering, "but I do not respect distortion." The professor's gaze locked onto his, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The air crackled with unspoken challenge. Then Hawthorne let out a short, sharp laugh. "Fascinating," he said, shaking his head slightly. "Well, since you seem to know so much, why do you not enlighten us? Tell me, if these African civilizations were so grand, why did they not withstand European colonization? What does that say about their supposed superiority?" Malcolm felt his fingers clench into fists beneath the desk. "What does it say about European civilizations that they could only rise by destroying and exploiting others?" he shot back. This time, a murmur spread through the class. The smirk on Hawthorne's face flickered again just for a second. "Well then," Hawthorne said after a pause, his tone clipped, "since you seem to have all the answers, I look forward to seeing your paper on the matter. A full research essay due in 1 week. Let us see if your arguments hold up under actual scrutiny." A few students exchanged knowing glances. Malcolm understood exactly what was happening. The professor was setting him up to fail, but Malcolm lifted his chin. "Fine." The smirk returned to Hawthorne's face. "Good," the professor said, turning away as if the conversation had never happened. But Malcolm knew this was just the beginning. That evening, Malcolm sat in his dorm, staring at the blinking cursor. On his laptop screen, the research paper loomed over him, its weight suffocating. He knew how this game worked. Hawthorne was not going to grade him fairly. This was a test, but not of academic merit. It was a test of whether he could be made to fold. His mind drifted back to his mother's words, the memory washing over him like a wave. "There will come a day when you feel like you are standing alone in a room full of people who doubt you. And when that day comes, you stand taller." He exhaled, running a hand over his face. A knock at the door. Aaron walked in, closing the door behind him. "That was bold, man," he said, sitting on the bed. "Had to be done," Malcolm muttered. Aaron sighed. "Look, I know Hawthorne. He's not the type to let this go. He's going to push you, make things harder." "I know. So what is the plan?" Malcolm stared at the blank document on his screen. "I write the best damn paper he has ever seen." Aaron let out a small chuckle. "You know he is going to try and tank your grade, right?" "Let him try." Aaron studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right. Then let us make sure this paper is bulletproof." Over the next week, Malcolm put everything into his research. He spent hours in the library, digging through sources, cross-referencing evidence. He knew he could not just write a good paper. He had to write one so airtight that even Hawthorne would struggle to justify a low grade. But as the days passed, the pressure mounted. Little things started happening. His essay submission portal mysteriously glitched the night before the deadline, forcing him to email the professor directly. His name was suddenly missing from the sign-up list for an important internship program. Professors who once greeted him warmly now seemed distant. It was subtle, but he saw it. One evening, as he was reviewing his citations in the library, he heard voices from the next aisle. Hawthorne really has it out for him. What did Carter expect? You do not go after a professor like that and walk away clean. Think he will drop the class. He should. Some people do not know their place. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, then forced himself to breathe. He would not be broken. The day the papers were returned, Malcolm walked into class prepared for whatever came next. Hawthorne handed back the essays one by one, his expression unreadable. When he finally placed Malcolm's paper on the desk, Malcolm saw the red ink slashed across the front. A Caminus. He let out a slow breath. He had expected it, but that did not mean it did not sting. He turned to the last page, reading the professor's. In comments, your argument lacks depth and fails to provide a compelling counterpoint. I expected more from you, Mr. Carter. Malcolm clenched his jaw. Aaron peeked over, eyes narrowing. A C-? Nah, man, that paper was solid. Malcolm flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the meticulous work he had put in. The citations, the historical analysis, it was all there. The grade had nothing to do with the quality of his work. Hawthorne was punishing him. Malcolm closed the paper. He could accept this quietly, take the hit, let the moment pass, or he could fight back. His pulse steadied. Rising from his chair, he picked up the paper and walked straight to the front of the room, stopping beside Hawthorne's desk. The class went silent. Hawthorne barely glanced up. Yes, Mr. Carter? Malcolm placed the paper on the desk. I would like to challenge this grade, he said, his voice even. The professor finally looked up, amusement flickering in his eyes. Oh, you believe your work deserves more? Malcolm met his gaze. I know. It does. A few students whispered to each other. Hawthorne leaned back slightly, tapping his pen against the desk. Challenging a grade requires substantial justification, he said, his voice smooth. You are welcome to take it up with the academic review board, but I must warn you, these things rarely end in favor of the student. Malcolm did not blink. Then I will see you there. Another ripple of whispers spread through the class. Hawthorne studied him for a long moment before his smirk returned. Very well, he said, leaning forward slightly. Let us see just how much you are willing to fight for this. Malcolm turned and walked back to his seat, feeling the weight of every gaze on him. He knew this was only the beginning, but he was ready.